Hi, everybody. John Atack, as you probably know, and my friend John Hunter, PhD. Hi, John.
Hi there, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. And yourself?
Yeah, good. Coming to the end of the year, a little bit less work, so yeah, feeling a bit more relaxed.
Good. And I hear that you have a publisher for your upcoming book.
It seems like it, yes. I signed a contract yesterday, and so now it's just the small task of ensuring that the book is in order so that they're happy to put it out there. But
Mm.
from the feedback I've received so far, yeah, I think it will be.
Yeah, I mean, as yet, I've only had time to skim your manuscript, but I'm tremendously impressed with the conversations we've had. And I think you have something very important and quite new to express. So I hope it will go well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I sent it to a sort of uh, new colleague of mine who's an emeritus professor. I haven't asked for permission to share her review, so I won't uh, give her name. But I thought it was quite a direct and positive review when she came back and she said, you know, when I first was asked to do this review, I thought it would be quite a chore, but as soon as I started reading it, I was
Mhm.
absolutely hooked and everything made sense and all that sort of thing. So I think that that's quite a yeah, that was really good to hear.
Mm. Yeah, certainly the impression that I had from, both from our conversations where you've been, um, you know, very exact and very succinct in what you said and articulate. But reading what I have read, it is a straightforward idea that you're putting forward. And let me underline again, I think a very important idea in a field where we should have noticed this before. That's what
And
I feel about it.
and I think that that's actually been quite a consistent feedback. So I've had a couple of colleagues read through the draft and they come back to me and they kind of say, this all makes complete sense. I can't believe nobody else has sort of figured this out before, you know? So I like that idea that it is quite intuitive. It does make sense. And it just sort of requires, you know, leading a person by the hand. So if you've got the first bit of information and then the second bit, then the third, then everything really
Mm.
just fits together quite nicely. And I suppose for anyone listening, the book is really on a natural explanation for religious experiences, particularly within Christianity. And it's not necessarily that it might only be applicable to Christianity, but that's the religion that I'm most familiar with, and that's the religion that um, I was a part of when I had what I believed to be a religious experience.
Mm.
So um, and again, we have spoken about this in some of the other discussions, but to very briefly summarize, in 2002, 2003, I was living in London. I had a manic episode, which is the elevated state of bipolar disorder, and I thought that I was having a religious experience, so much so that I resigned from my job. I started working for the church, and I was, you know, very much convinced that it was, you know, 100% convinced that it was
Mm.
an experience of God. And as often happens with bipolar disorder, the mania or the elevated state was followed by a very deep depression. And during that time, it really urged me to consider the possibility that it wasn't something supernatural and that maybe it was something natural that was going on. And I kind of thought to myself, well, if I could be fooled by an experience like this, could other people not also be fooled by similar natural experiences? And that really kicked off my interest
Mm.
in religious and spiritual experiences. And essentially, the book makes the argument that anyone, or pretty much anyone, can experience these elevated states that are typically associated with bipolar disorder. There's a very specific process that can put people into these states. Um, and Christianity, whether intentionally or not, facilitates that precise process.
Mm.
So the argument is that if a person goes through a period of psychological suffering, which might include feelings like guilt, shame, inadequacy, and fear, and I think anyone that's spent a bit of time in Christianity can understand how those feelings might emerge and how they might be prompted by some of the specific verses in the Bible, and even more particularly by certain denominations that you might have a leader of the church that really emphasizes those elements. And so you have the sense of guilt, shame, inadequacy, and fear, and you might ruminate on those feelings for a period of time. And then Christianity also offers a solution to those feelings. So, if you give your life to Christ and you ask for forgiveness, basically you're wiped clean. So you have this process of psychological suffering followed by social reward. So all of that guilt, shame, inadequacy, and fear is abruptly removed and replaced with a sense of love and affirmation and reconciliation with God. And what I argue in the book, and I provide a fair amount of evidence for, is that this can lead to an elevation in dopamine or seeking arousal, that the symptoms or the effects of seeking arousal are just what you might anticipate in a religious experience, the feelings of love and joy and hope and optimism and boldness and incredible meaning and significance and those sorts of things. So if you experience that elevated state in a religious context, so for example, in a church or even at home praying for forgiveness, it's quite plausible that you might interpret that elevated state as an encounter with God or an experience of the Holy Spirit or some sort of religious experience. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Battle for the Mind by William Sargent, written in, I think, 1957. He, as a psychiatrist writing in the 1950s, is very cautious in what he's saying. He says, look, I'm a Methodist, so I'm going to write something about John Wesley. And he gives a description of a typical revival meeting hosted by John Wesley, where there'd be the threat of hell, which would be, writ large. And so you would induce this feeling of fear and the shame in the person. And then there'd be the, and heaven is where all tensions are released and you will be perfectly happy, you'll be in a bliss state. And then his final line was, as you are walking home tonight, you could be stricken, words to that effect. And people would, quite typically at these meetings, they'd start twirling round and fall to the floor. And when they rose up, they'd have been converted. They'd been filled with the Holy Spirit from their perception. And this was so powerful that Sargent says there's a description of a man who starts out from the back of the hall shouting criticism at Wesley, gets a few steps, turns around and falls to the ground and comes up converted. So it's very powerful medicine that we're dealing with here. And I think it's very important to separate out that if you do feel you've had a supernatural experience of some kind, it is good to look at natural experiences. And, just to, not denying anything, not going against anything here, but it could well be that, if you've done some sort of exercise or, a meditative practice, that you've actually stimulated dopamine and that now you're suddenly getting that reward of all of this dopamine flooding your system.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think when I've mentioned the topic of the book to anyone, it comes across as, oh, this is, going to be very controversial. And I guess it might be. And maybe the idea is that I'm a sort of hard-nosed atheist and I want to destroy religion or something like that. And that's certainly not the case. So I kind of feel like, sometimes there's amazing value in an experience. And if you believe it to be a religious experience, it can bring about incredible change in your life, as it does in many people's lives. And that can be a wonderful thing. And I think that you and I are both very aware of just the fact that sometimes it can be used for manipulative purposes, and sometimes it can be used as a tool of manipulation. So I don't want to, undermine anyone's personal experiences. If this has been something useful to them, if it's something that's brought them a greater sense of meaning and direction in life, and it's not hurting anyone else, then I don't want to detract from that at all. But certainly the idea that there may be a natural explanation for some of these religious experiences is something that for me was very much worth exploring, because, you know, I had this experience that I was so convinced was a religious experience. And then I realized that it was actually pathological. And so I really wanted to make sense of that. And I mean, I think the comparison in the book is, you know, in the past, things like storms and eclipses and earthquakes and disease and all sorts of things were attributed to God or gods. And subsequently, we've realized that there are ways that those things can that they can be explained without invoking the supernatural. And my argument is that there are ways of explaining some religious experiences without invoking the supernatural.
Yeah, and the point is to, I think, to be skeptical in a healthy way, and to look at the possibilities, the explanations that are out there. And it doesn't necessarily detract from somebody's religious belief. We're all entitled to our own metaphor through which to assess the universe. And the reality is, as far as I know, none of us has actually found the truth. None of us actually understands completely everything that's going on. But if we do attribute supernatural explanations, which of course many authoritarian cults do, then we can be led and we can be deceived, and we can be brought into psychological slavery by people who are in fact, you know, Wizard of Oz characters, simply manipulating things. I've just got a chapter coming out. I think the book's called Eastern Religions and Spirituality and Psychiatry, or something like that, which I'm told is going to be announced at the American Psychiatric Association meeting this month. Very exciting. And I'm one of about 50 people who's contributed a little scrap to it. But the other people are largely practitioners of a particular religion who are psychiatrists and often professors of psychiatry, and who are putting forward their view. I mean, I've only read Professor Koenig's chapter on Buddhism, which I was really impressed by. You know, he's really fair-minded in the way that he approaches it. But I'm told that there was some trepidation of the chapter that Steve Hassan and I have contributed, because in it we list one by one techniques that you can use to create a physiological reaction. So meditation, staring at things, which brings about the Ganzfeld effect, or hyperventilation, which is practiced by Rajneeshis and other people. They go until they feel dizzy. And as I went through this list, and sleep deprivation and fasting and all of these things, you're sort of going, actually, all of these methods are applied in conventional religion. And those who undertake them believe that they're having a transcendent experience. It's not to say that there aren't transcendent experiences. It is to say there are ways of explaining, you know, many of these experiences. Some of them.
And I like that idea that there's a book with multiple perspectives kind of coming through, because that also wasn't a goal of mine. I mean, I've been sitting with this since 2003, you know, and kind of having the major explanation since like 2010. So 13, nearly 14 years now I've been sitting with this. And if somebody had just had a conversation with me in depth about this, I probably would never have, you know, written a PhD on it or produced a book on it. But it's almost like I just want to have this conversation. So I'm quite open to people pulling it apart, and I'd love people to do that, you know. So if it's possible, if my thinking is flawed, then somebody must explain to me why it's flawed. But it makes a lot of sense to me. And in terms of I use, for example, William Lane Craig, who's a very well-known Christian apologist and analytical philosopher. So, I mean, if you look at any of the debates with any of the atheists, with Sam Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss, and more recently he sat down and chatted to Jordan Peterson and Alex O'Connor and a bunch of those guys. William Lane Craig is the sort of Christian apologist that seems to be called into these debates quite frequently. And because I don't want to straw man a version of Christianity or a version of conversion or belief formation that's only adhered to by a small number of people, or by people who are incapable of critical thinking, or who are unwilling to think critically about things, I wanted to use him as an example, because he seems to be almost the poster child of critical thinking within Christianity. And I think that's what is notable about him, is that he makes a distinction between knowing God exists and showing God exists. So while he has all of these intellectual and academic arguments for showing that God exists, he basically says the fundamental way that we know Christianity is true is through the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. He basically says that's how we know that it's true. And then he says arguments and evidence can then confirm the Spirit's witness. So it's not kind of an uneducated group of people that I'm sort of poking fun at for the fact that they are using personal experience of God as the primary way that they know that God exists. I'm actually looking at somebody who is very capable of critical thinking, probably a lot more than me in many ways, based on his training in philosophy. And I'm kind of going, well, let's look at him as an example. Let's look at his arguments, and let's just see whether there are some problems with his arguments. So, for example, he says, if the skeptic can show me or give me good reason as to why I should doubt these personal experiences, then I'm quite happy to relook at them. And I think by the end of my book, he should have good reason to doubt his experiences, and to kind of think, well, maybe basing my belief on these personal experiences, particularly given what he went through prior to his religious conversion, is maybe something that he should do. So, for example, he explains that in the months leading up to his religious experience, he was feeling an incredible amount of psychological suffering. So feelings of guilt and shame and inadequacy and all of those kind of things. And then he converted, he gave his life to Christ. And then he felt this incredible infusion of joy filling him up. And he felt like a balloon that was just about to burst. And, there were tears, and it was profound. And, my first chapter is called A Tale of Two Religious Experiences, because I basically describe his religious experience, then I describe my own religious experience. And in terms of what they look like, they look very much identical. The only real difference is that I experienced depression afterwards and then questioned that experience, whereas he didn't. And yeah.
Yeah, and we come into that area, the great William James, author of The Varieties of Religious Experience and credited as one of the fathers of psychology. And there he talks about conversion experiences with significant insight. But he also brings up this idea of noesis, that which we feel we know, that which we believe we know, that we have a sense of certainty about.
Yeah.
And that takes us to the point of, how do we test our experiences? How do we know the truthfulness of our experiences? And which puts us into a place where somebody's saying, well, I know God exists. It's sort of, what sort of knowledge is this we're talking about? Is this something we can measure in some way scientifically? Or as Stephen Jay Gould and others have said, is religion and spirituality a distinct magisterium from science? It's Robert Pirsig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, this idea that you have Plato and Aristotle, you have quality and quantity. Science measures quantity, and spirituality is the experience of qualities, or even qualia within the mind.
Yeah. When when you kind of listen to, for example, William Lane Craig talking about why he trusts his experience, he says, it's so transformed my life that I couldn't convince myself that it wasn't a religious experience. And I kind of think, well, for somebody who's so strong in terms of critical thinking, the logic in that is immediately, the flaw in the logic is immediately apparent, because there are people from multiple religions around the world who have religious experiences. They are just as convinced as he is that their experiences are genuine and their lives are frequently transformed, just like his was. So unless he thinks that, all Christians are somehow better at distinguishing between natural experiences that feel like religious experiences and genuine religious experiences than all non-Christian theists, which would be a very strange thing for him to believe, then he has to confront the possibility that there are these natural experiences that are incredibly compelling, and that everyone, including him, can confuse a natural experience with a religious experience. I mean, it's such an odd thing to think that I definitely know that it was a religious experience, but other people can't work it out. Other people from other faiths can't work it out. And almost the claim that Christians can work it out, because he's basically saying to them, you can trust your experience of God as evidence, but apparently people from other religions can't trust those natural or those religious experiences. So it's a little bit, it's a bit of a bizarre line of arguments, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, and I mean, in Scientology, there are many mantras within Scientology. I've just talked with Joe Zimhart, who explained to me that one of the definitions of a mantra is a spell. But one of the mantras in Scientology is, what's true for you is true. And I always balked at this concept that because I believe it, it's true. And this idea of, indeed, when I left Scientology, I mean, when I removed my head from Scientology, I decided that there was a difficulty, which is that I had spent 9 years learning how to view the world through the lens of Scientology. How was I now going to view Scientology? Was I going to use, and so I had to the best of my ability, reject everything and say, I will reincorporate those ideas, which make sense. I'll look at it piecemeal and see what makes sense. And 40 years, it is now 40 years since I left. I'm kind of going, haven't actually reincorporated any of it, because as I looked at it out there, it was all based upon what's true for you is true. And you get in some very simple ways of showing that there's a problem with that, particularly with Scientology, where all Scientologists believe they've had past lives, they've reincarnated. Hubbard gives various
people have been the same person in the past life.
Well, that's explicable because we're all composed of thousands, even millions of little body thetans, these little beings. And you could have had one that was with Napoleon and another one that was with Jesus, so, the rationality can be brought to bear and make fools of us all fundamentally. But this idea that Scientologists have all experienced these past lives going back, according to Hubbard in different texts, 60, 73, 76 trillion years. That's a million, or indeed 1.25 quadrillion years, which is 1,000 million, if I've counted right.
That sounds a lot more plausible.
Yeah. And here we are in this tiny little short-lived universe that's only been here for 13.8 billion years. So if you think you're carrying around with you the mental image pictures, as he puts it, the memories of all of these lives, all of these trillions of years, then when you come up with one of them in one of your sessions, your Scientology sessions, it should be easy to say, well, okay, you lived in China 200 years ago, talk a little bit of Mandarin. And that was the test that I tried, and I've met more than 1,000 Scientologists. Not one of them could remember a single sentence from a a language they had spoken in a past life. So they might as well not have bothered, frankly. Why have the experience if you can't do anything with it?
Yeah.
But people will dance around that and go, yeah, well, what's true for me is true. I believe this is true, therefore it's true. And it's sort of, oh no, we cannot base things upon internal experience. There has to be some external measure.
Yeah, and I mean, we kind of see that split in research. When you look at positivists versus interpretivists, for example, the idea that a person's personal opinion is actually considered valid and that's their reality and whatever, and that's true in some things. With art, that's true. With music, that's true. So if you think that the Rolling Stones are better than the Beatles, then to you that may be true. I mean, you're definitely
It
wrong.
shows just how old we are.
Yeah, you're definitely wrong, but that can be true for you. But there are some things that are a lot more sort of objective, and certainly there's going to be contradictions in different people's views of reality. Yeah.
And we've seen, with Derrida and postmodernism spreading out of literary deconstruction, which, is fair enough, and becoming this dreadful monster that roams through academia saying, there are correct views, but everybody's opinion is valid. So my opinion about relativity is just as good as Einstein's. What did he know? I think it's three witches and a cauldron going hubble bubble. That's how gravity came about. It's obviously ridiculous, but I think we are seeing a kind of degeneration academically throughout the world. We're seeing people who no longer rely upon scientific evidence, and we're seeing it in government as well. We have a government minister, Michael Gove, who said, we've all had enough of experts, when he decided to bring an examination system in to replace all of the assessment by teachers, basically saying we don't trust teachers at all. They're all going to lie to get the statistics up. We'll have this exam system against the reality, which is that every 2 years, the PISA tables are done all around the world for all the schools. And every 2 years, Scandinavia comes top in the literacy tables. And they have one examination in their whole system. No SATs, no testing everything. Right at the end, you do an exam. So they're not scared to death all the time or learning the answers of the SATs. They're learning how to do things. They have a higher level of literacy and competence. And experts could have told Michael Gove that, but we've all had enough of experts. And politicians notoriously are practicing something which seems far much more like a cult religion to me than a true estimation of the world. We would have tackled global warming, 50 years ago? We would have done something about it, but it's all the kind of, no, we can just push it on down further, kick it down the road a bit further.
There's also the element, and again, you've noted this before, that you can always find an expert to support your perspective. We see that with large group awareness trainings. We see that with, climate science. We've got, I've got a handful of people who say this, and that kind of stops the progress of whatever's being discussed.
Yeah.
Not that I know very much about that area myself.
Safest not to.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that's you kind of notice with a lot of the authorities you see online on various things, that they will start off in their area of competency, and then suddenly you hear them commenting on things that they really have no business commenting on. So yeah,
and it can become, looking back at something you said, it can become an argument rather than I welcome correction. It's one of the things I learned about having left Scientology. If somebody wants to say you made a mistake there and it should be this, then I seek to actually, if I make a mistake on the channel here, I want people to comment on it. I want to be aware of it, and I will thank them for doing it. This is not the cult of John. This is the group of us all trying to understand the world better. And unfortunately, in academia and in science, as well as in religion, you still have these dogmatic bigoted beliefs where people are, and the whole idea of science is to progress by challenging, to get more evidence, to reinterpret the evidence. I mean, one of the most dangerous pieces of science ever done was Raymond Dart in your country there, who was at Witwatersrand. What beautiful language Afrikaans can be. Just wonderful. And he'd got things out of the Schwarzkrans cave. I hope I'm getting somewhere close to the pronunciation. Yeah. And from this had determined that there were these tusks, and they'd been used to stab other hominids because there were holes in the skulls of other hominids. And this, it was announced, I think, in the 1920s, and it became one of the fundamental ideas that the Nazis adopted, that we're all ferociously aggressive. That's our nature. Konrad Lorenz, the Nazi professor, became famous for his ideas on aggression, which were still quite dominant in the 1970s. Then Dart's place at Witwatersrand was taken by a man called Bob Brain. And in 1977, he analyzed these tusks with an electron microscope, and he saw marks on them. And he then had his students go out with replicas of them and dig up roots, and found that this was the marking. He then worked out that when you looked at these skulls in the cave, there would be 2 penetrative holes. So the tusks had still been attached to the tiger-like creature, and it was not evidence at all of human predation upon other humans. I mean, we can go beyond all of that now and say, well, the fourth force in evolution, the fourth dimension in evolution is cultural transmission. And we have no excuse saying, oh, we're like chimps or we're like bonobos, because we're smart enough to change our minds at a moment's notice, and indeed our genetics. So, but it shows that the interpretation of something can be thoroughly wrong, can be thoroughly misguided, and then can be held forward to be truth. And what we're asking for is for people to keep discussing, to keep finding evidence. And it seems that you found your way into an area that has been profoundly underexplored. I think your work and Yuval Laor's work are the most original things I've seen in 40 years of working in this field, that you've brought something to the table that we can reassess the behavior of people and possibly do something helpful, because we understand this. And once one understands what the dopaminergic defense hypothesis is, and you know, how dopamine is raised up and then dumped down, it tells us a tremendous amount. I remember talking, I have a friend who's has a PhD in comparative religion. He's a theologian. I haven't spoken with him for way too long, but he came to me because he's also an Anglican vicar, and was worried about whether the Alpha Course and Walking in the Light, these things that are standardly used in the Anglican Church, were in any way cultish. And when I told him, yes, they are, he laughed at me. He just wouldn't accept that there was any manipulation happening within these procedures. Whereas to me, looking from the outside, they're very mild in comparison to some of the things I've seen done, but they do pull you in a certain direction, and they do seek to reformulate the way you think. And
I mean, I guess the question there is, I mean, what doesn't do that? I mean, surely the entire idea of it is that only at a certain point it becomes, and to use the term from the book, abnormal, you know? So I know that you are not comfortable with the term normal and abnormal, but just in terms of defining an experience or a process or something as being problematic, we may not know exactly where that cutoff is, but we might be able to see a process and we go, well, that's definitely problematic. And another one, we go, well, that's definitely not. And somewhere in between, clearly there's a crossover, even though we don't know exactly where it is, I suppose. And I mean, I actually took the Alpha course when I was living in London at Holy Trinity Brompton with Nicky Gumbel, who I think was the person who put it together, I believe. And at the time, I mean, I hadn't been exposed to LGATs, I hadn't been exposed to any forms of manipulation in terms of understanding them, so I maybe didn't pay attention to it, but it seemed relatively benign. But I guess that's how they all seem. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and I would say that too, that we have to rate things in terms of what is or isn't normal. It's probably just a matter of definition. If something is within the bell curve of
exactly.
usual experience, then I'm happy with the word. It's just the 1950s craze to make people normal and what that
Yes.
might mean. So where we're dealing with normal being a fairly wide range of traits, and
Yeah.
abnormal being beyond those traits in one way, and subnormal being beneath those traits in another
Yeah.
way. And everything, every educational experience, I have a friend whose daughter, I think she was 7 at the time, and she was being given mindfulness classes in school. And I was a little bit alarmed about this, because mindfulness meditations definitely induce a physiological state, the Ganzfeld effect, where people will start to, there'll be visual impairment. There can be audio impairment. I have a great deal of experience of it, because I learned Zen meditation as an
Yeah.
18-year-old, and then had 9 years in Scientology of staring at people, confronting people, learning how to do that, and thinking there must be something wrong with me because of these hallucinations, these mild hallucinations I have, and later realizing there's something wrong with you if you don't. The brain fills in. We provide information where there isn't quite enough. We turn up the sensor to see if we're missing information and start hearing the feedback in our own system. So yeah, anything, kids going to kindergarten, when I see a bunch of kids sat around a teacher, I'm sure we could analyze that in terms of the guru and the followers, and these poor impressionable 4-year-olds and what's
Yeah.
happening to them. So it is a matter of degree, and then it's a matter of what happens to the person afterwards. Are they then pulled into a sex slave cult, or does it just mean that they're nice to people and go to church on a Sunday, which is, don't really
Well,
have
I
a
mean,
problem with that.
yeah, I mean, I had this conversation with somebody a little while ago, a couple of years ago, and the idea of manipulation. So you can manipulate somebody in a way that's going to be highly beneficial for them. So to me, the manipulation is not necessarily about the end result, although when you combine manipulation with an end result where you're taking advantage of them, then clearly that's the most problematic form of that. But you certainly could use processes to shift the way a person thinks, behaves, and whatever, that circumnavigates their critical thinking to get them to do things that would be beneficial for them in the long term. And I guess the ethical question around that is a slightly different and more complicated one.
Yeah. Is there a hidden agenda? To what extent will the person come to understand your motives in teaching them, and what's being sold? And we do know that people can have the very best of intentions and create catastrophe out of what they're doing. So having, openness and transparency, those words that politicians use but don't actually apply to them in any way, they are a necessary part. Manipulation per se is really something where it differs from education or straightforward influence, in that there is an agenda. There is something that you want the person to do, whether it's buying a set of cookware or joining the Moonies. There's something else going on, and that openness is important. And again, that's about taking a scientific view of the world, taking a view of the world where you're open to change and reinterpretation of ideas, to move forward, to understand better, to do better in the world, to achieve something more.
And I think that
Go ahead.
I think that the comment that you made earlier about being open to reviewing your own things that you've said, and getting feedback even on these YouTube videos where somebody might say, oh, what about this? And you've got to kind of think about it, and that you welcome that sort of thing is great. And you've noted that obviously in cults or problematic groups, and sometimes in religions, people are very reluctant to review what they've done or thought. And I mean, that's one of the primary findings from social psychology, is that our behaviors are often better indicators or predictors of our beliefs than our beliefs are of our behaviors. So once we've done something, and Festinger would call it cognitive dissonance, and Robert Cialdini would call it commitment and consistency. Once we've behaved in a particular way, and particularly in a way where we've publicly revealed our views about something, then it becomes very difficult to go back on some of those things, because it threatens who we are. Religion can be a big part of who we are. If you're part of a problematic group, that group is often going to be a very big part of who you are. And with academics, it's the same thing. So I like to think that if somebody came up and looked at my work and said, well, you're completely wrong over here, and this is, the logic is flawed, that I would graciously just be like, oh, well, thank you. That's amazing. I'm so happy about that.
I'm sure you would, John.
But unconsciously, of course, it's going to be like, I've been thinking this for 13 years now, and I've done a PhD, and I've done whatever. So it's going to be very difficult to acknowledge those things. But I think at least being aware of that unconscious need to want to remain right, and how this is a big part of my identity, will hopefully make me a little bit more open to hearing criticism and processing it. Because I think ultimately my identity, as somebody with bipolar disorder, I think a lot of my identity comes from wanting to be rational. Because I can be so irrational at times, that's something that I value so highly. I don't want to believe things that are not true, because when you're delusional, you believe these really strange things. And so I almost want to overcompensate on the side of rationality. And so if that is where my identity is coming from, hopefully that means that if somebody presents me with evidence that contradicts my arguments or weakens them or whatever, I can take it and kind of go, okay, well, that makes sense, and I can shift my views accordingly. Because basically that's what I'm asking people to do when I'm reading this book. I'm asking people who may have beliefs, they may be Christian, for example, they may be reading this book and it might threaten what they believe. Yeah. And so I can't ask people to do that and have something that questions something so central to who they are, if I'm not willing to do the same if information comes in my direction,
And also psychologically, we have the fundamental attribution error that we tend to have a view of, so if somebody's late coming to a meeting with me, then it's, why are they messing with me? Why have they done this? And if I'm late coming to a meeting with someone else, it's because there was bad traffic. Yeah. That evaluation of other people, leveling that out and being willing to tolerate those things is difficult. Also, of course, when one has built a reputation upon something, it's like if somebody comes to me and says, actually, and it has happened. It has happened actually years ago. There's a guy called Perry Chapdelaine, who was a mathematician who was involved with Ron Hubbard in the early 1950s and was the co-author of some of Hubbard's work, the Dianetic Axioms, in fact. And he said, Hubbard said, bring a bottle of scotch and let's write something that looks scientific. And this guy had left in the 1950s, and I'm in touch with him. And he wrote me this letter where he said, as you get older, you'll realize that Ron Hubbard was right about most things. And I've got 40 years older during that time, and it still hasn't happened. I'm still not clever enough for that particular penny to have dropped. Yeah. It still looks like ludicrous nonsense to me from where I am. But to be able to try and take that position of humility, that thing that is preached within Christianity and various other religions, to actually sit back from it and go, yeah, let's consider that. What makes that very difficult is when somebody is aggressive in their approach towards you. So rather than disagreeing agreeably, as I'm known to say, they will come and call you an idiot and start trying to, or worse yet, they're a novice in something and they've read one textbook about it, which is now the way, the truth, and the life, and they will now quote that at you to disprove what you're doing. rather than, so wanting an argument, wanting a fight, rather than wanting a discussion or a debate, and
Yeah.
an attempt to.
And I think that that's part of the problem with discussions that happen in YouTube comments, is that it's public. So there's the possibility of feeling embarrassed. So people will kind of defend themselves to the death rather than acknowledging whether they're kind of right or wrong. In terms of that attribution error, I think it is such an important thing, and I think hopefully the book comes across in a way that, I basically say my view on whether God exists or not is still up for grabs. I'm not an atheist, so there's definitely not a hardline view there. I also think that anyone who reads it and understands the depression that I went through, having quit my job and working for the church, and the sort of suffering that I went through for, months. I think it's difficult for somebody to read that and kind of think to themselves, I can't understand why this person would question their beliefs at this point. I think it's very reasonable when you read it to kind of go, well, I think anyone in that position would maybe question what was going on. So maybe I've got too much optimism and too much faith in humanity, and maybe people are just going to hate me, and they're going to be sort of terrible comments about what my motives were. But my motives weren't to try to attack religion or to attack Christianity. It was very much just a process for me of trying to figure this thing out. And you've been very, very complimentary about the sort of novelty of the work that I've done, but a lot of it had kind of been done already. I feel like I've sort of just put pieces together in a way maybe that people haven't done before. So the relationship between dopamine and religion has been, in the last couple of decades, there's been a huge amount of research that's been done on that. So both from pharmacological studies, so through the use of various drugs, and people have religious experiences, functional imaging of people's brains while they're having mystical and religious experience. So the literature on the relationship between dopamine and religious experiences is quite extensive. The literature on the relationship between bipolar mania and religious experiences pre-existed. All that I've done is kind of said, well, here's a mechanism by which you can generate basically bipolar type experiences. So experiences that mirror or look a lot like hypomania and mania. This is the process that you can use to do it, and this is how Christianity incorporates this process. So that's really just the thing that I've done. It's not as if I've kind of worked out a whole bunch of stuff. I've really just kind of gone, okay, well, those things seem to fit together in an interesting way, which coincidentally is something that is associated with bipolar disorder. So if you read the book, the whole thing of kind of loose associations and of linking things in a slightly unique and novel way is one of the things you often see with elevations in dopamine or with hypomania and mania. And those associations can become so loose that it becomes just delusional, which has happened to me a number of times. And as I showed you with that book that I wrote before, that was, I don't know, 800 pages or whatever that I wrote in a month. Certainly a lot of loose associations there and very difficult to follow, and it makes no sense and quite delusional. But I think what I've managed to do now after a long time is really just distill the ideas down into something that's quite short. The book is probably about 100, 110 pages, not very long, only the information that's absolutely necessary. And from everyone that's read it so far, apparently it makes a lot of sense, even if you don't have a background in psychology or neuroscience. I think I explain it in a way that is fairly easy for most people to follow.
Your writing is certainly very lucid. And yes, it is a matter of a synthesis, isn't it? That people have been looking at all sorts of things. When we mentioning temporal lobe epilepsy, in 1977, Bear-Fedio deliver their paper, and we've got this wonderful novel thing. which used to be called Dostoevsky syndrome.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that nobody had noticed it. And in fact, Dostoevsky had described that and various other conditions. I mean, I'm reading The Devils at the moment. And in there, there's a wonderful Dostoevsky novel called A Friend of the Family, which is quite hard to get hold of. It was last translated in the 1920s.
Yeah.
But he had hypergraphia, which is the first symptom of Dostoevsky syndrome. He couldn't stop writing. And we are so lucky that a man of such perception was able to keep on writing. In Friend of the Family, he gives the best description I've ever read of a malignant narcissist, 100 years before Eric Fromm put it into the literature. So, but that perceiving something as it's going on, synthesizing things and making them useful. And in this case, by pulling together this work, it not only shows us what large group awareness trainings are doing in basically bringing about hypomanic or excessively happy states and how deliberate that is. It also applies further, that when we look at the way that Scientology works, or the Krishna consciousness movement, or Rajneesh, or wherever, this is work that can be applied there. And there are certain tests that can be done. It can be found out to what extent this is true. And let's underline again, I too am not an atheist. I'm an agnostic. I follow Eric Fromm in this, and I'm an agnostic mystic. I am somebody who wishes to understand the truth, and day by day realizes how much further away from it he is.
Yeah.
But and so it's certainly, I talked last week with Sean McCraney, who is a redeemed predator. He's somebody who pretty much is a sociopath, or whatever word you want to use, and then had a realization, which for him was an experience of God, and for the last 26 years has been a decent or fairly decent human being, has tried hard to, and works with it every day. And I have only admiration for this man and what he's done. And it's of no concern to me what he believes in, so long as what he believes in leads to him behaving in a good and beneficent way towards other people, which he does. So just in case anybody's, and another little point about YouTube channels and comments, they know who we are, but most of the comments that we're going to get will come from troll 1479 or what have you. And so that we do get these people, and we delete their comments. Sorry. If people just have spleen to express and no rational point, then not really interested. But anybody that wants to discuss these ideas, will let you know when this goes up. And
I think something that you've said now also just reminds me. You mentioned that it allows him to be a better person, and it allows him to behave in a way that is obviously better for society and everyone around him. The argument that I make in my book is that it's actually our natural capacity for conscience that allows groups like LGATs and Christianity to generate feelings of guilt, shame, inadequacy, fear, that sort of thing. If we didn't have an ability to feel bad about things that we've done, if we didn't have an ability to feel like we weren't measuring up to whatever standards are being set, if we didn't feel like I've done something wrong, I've hurt somebody, I'm concerned about people in my family, all of those negative, all of that psychological suffering comes from a position of conscience. So my argument is that without the ability to feel those negative emotions, you're not going to get that elevation of dopamine that you might interpret as God. So while the arguments has been made that without God, people would just go around doing whatever they felt like doing. I think maybe that is true, but what they feel like doing, I believe, is probably good things. I don't have such a negative view of humanity. I think most people naturally want to do good. They naturally like seeing people doing well. They naturally care about other people. That's what we're like. We're social. We've evolved to be social, and they're very good arguments that morality is something that has evolved. So I don't have that fear that if you had to remove God from the equation, people would just start raping and murdering and doing all those sorts of things. I actually think that the reason that people have certainly some religious experiences because of that capacity for conscience, which may have evolved rather than, may have come from God.
Although, yes. And we get into the usual discussion of what on earth we mean by God. And maybe the quickest way to head off that argument is to look at, I believe, and I'm sure there's a philologist in the audience who'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the word God and the word good are cognate. They come from the same place. And so if we are looking to say there is goodness in the universe, and we can tap into that, even if it's something that we create before we tap into it, then that too could be useful. We then have the impersonalists, the Buddhists who believe in Buddha mind and not an individual consciousness, the Taoists who believe in the Tao, the Egyptians who believed in Ma'at, beyond, and Chinese philosophy pushes towards the idea that the gods themselves are simply manifestations of forces, and these forces are generated by us. I think spiritually, I lost faith in just about everything as I went along, and it didn't seem necessary, and it didn't bother me, and I couldn't, I don't think about, as Zhang Su said, I don't know where I was before I was born. I don't know where I am after I die. So let's get on with it. Let's be in the eternal now and do what we can. So I think, and Meister Eckhart in the Christian tradition, that God proceeds from the Godhead, and the Godhead proceeds from the ground of being. And so there are lots of lovely and elegant ways of looking at this. There's no need to come down to a simple level of, the beardy guy that Michelangelo did a big picture of, which I think was blasphemous, really, if you look at the commandments and not portraying God. But let's not go against Michelangelo. He's a clever bloke. But we don't have to become that attached. I also feel that when people become aggressive, when their beliefs are questioned, it's because they don't really believe it. They want, if they're content within their beliefs, and I have many friends who are, then they don't feel argumentative about it. They don't feel challenged. They go, well, yeah, I believe in God. You don't have to.
Yeah.
And we go from there.
Yeah, and I think that all of those manifestations or versions of God that you've mentioned are not things that I know very much about. And I think maybe my naivety in this space is quite a good thing. I've got a very limited understanding. I'm like, well, this is how it works. I think it works maybe in Christianity based on my limited understanding of other religions. So this is the one that I kind of know about. Yeah. And what you said earlier, I like, because I think that it's likely to be true, just because I'm talking about something that is based on human neurochemistry, not on Christian neurochemistry. So I do think that the findings and the arguments are going to be transferable and relevant in other spaces, but it will be, I think if you're a Buddhist and you read it, you might go, oh, okay, well, that actually makes sense here. I certainly think that from the little that I understand of Scientology, that people might read it and kind of go, oh, okay, well, that would explain maybe what happened in this sort of session over here. Same thing, with the Moonies and their workshops and that sort of thing. So I think that people will be able to connect the dots in their own lives. But even at a more basic level, so stepping away from religious beliefs, the process of psychological suffering followed by reward is something that you see in any work of literature, in any movie, in any whatever, just not at the same level. I mean, a really good movie or book is one that has you worried and concerned and uncertain of how this thing is going to turn out. And then there's resolution at the end. And then you feel the sense of kind of reward. And that's, if you kind of feel like, I know exactly how this thing's going to end, it doesn't generate the same level of joy and whatever. And that's not going to be the same as going through a 3, 4, 5 day large group awareness training, or maybe as a Christian contemplating guilt, shame, and inadequacy, and really feeling all of these things about who you are as a human, and then suddenly being freed from it. But, if you watch a great movie, it's going to get you to feel some of those things to a slightly lesser degree, and then you're going to get the resolution at the end. And so I think that the applications of the dopaminergic defense, or whatever you want to call it, move beyond just talking about religion as well.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. And I think that we exist in a universe of belief. I'm told, because I'm certainly never going to read it, that Immanuel Kant put forward the view that there is the universe around us, but we each of us live in our interpretation of the universe. And understanding the extent to which our neurochemistry affects our interpretation of the universe will allow us to make better decisions, I believe. So, I think it's important. Well, there we are. And this was going to be a short one, John.
Wasn't, I mean, it was fairly short, wasn't it?
It's about an hour.
Oh, that's good for us.
It's about right. It's about right. Yeah. So, tremendous pleasure talking with you as ever, and we'll come back in a couple of months and do some more. Hopefully.
Yeah, and hopefully by the next time that we chat, the book will be available, and I can get you to put up a link to a site or something like that. But still a bit of work to do there.
Yeah.
But thanks so much, and have a great break over Christmas or whatever your festivities involve.
Hanukkah or
exactly.
Diwali or whatever I'm celebrating this time. Won't be Diwali then, but that was just the only festival that came to mind from another religion at that point. Yeah. Grand. Thank you so much, John. Always a pleasure.
Thanks. All right. Cheers then.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.